About a month and a half ago, I published a video comparing the VR performance of the RTX 4080 to the RTX 5070 Ti in Half Life Alyx, where I was surprised to see the 5070 Ti performed significantly better. In that video, I promised I'd be back to compare more games, so here we are. Since I already made a video about it, I'm not going to spend a lot of time looking at Half Life Alyx, but for those who have not seen that video and do not plan on watching it ever, I'm going to quickly show you how the 5070 Ti compares with the 4080 in this game. As a quick side note, for all the game comparisons in this video, I either used the game's built-in benchmark or did my best to walk the same path to try to give us as close to a one-to-one comparison as possible. Okay, now back to Half Life Alyx and our regularly scheduled program. For this game, I used Virtual Desktop's godlike graphics quality setting, which uses a render resolution of 3072 by 3264 per eye, or 6144 by 3264 total resolution. For the refresh rate, I set it to 120 Hz and set Half Life Alyx's graphics quality to Ultra Fidelity. As you can see, the 5070 Ti ran stably at 120 FPS at these settings, whereas the 4080 saw a lot of frame rate fluctuation. And this is why I really wanted to make this video. All the flat gaming benchmarks out there show the 4080 and the 5070 Ti perform pretty much identically, but that is not the case in this game. So I wanted to find out if Half Life Alyx is just an outlier, or if the architecture and other hardware differences in the 5070 Ti are actually helping it perform better in VR in general.
What?
I next fired up Lone Echo 2, and right away you'll notice I'm not using FPS VR here, and that is because Lone Echo 2 is an Oculus exclusive and cannot run using the Steam VR runtime, which is required to use FPS VR. All of you who are familiar with Virtual Desktop will recognize I'm using Virtual Desktop's performance overlay for this one, and that I'm also using Virtual Desktop's Ultra graphics quality rather than Godlike, which uses a slightly lower render resolution of 2688 by 2880 per eye, or 5376 by 2880 total resolution. After the huge performance difference I saw in Half Life Alyx, I was kind of expecting to see the 5070 Ti outperform the 4080 again in this title. But if you watch the frame rate counter in this section of video, you'll notice that while the frame rate between the 4080 and the 5070 Ti was close, the 5070 Ti actually had a lot more performance dips, and while the 4080 also had some performance dips, most of the time it was able to maintain a higher frame rate overall, thus making it the slightly better performer in this game. Performance in Le Mans Ultimate was very close between the two GPUs. While the average FPS shows the 4080 around 1 FPS faster overall, I gotta tell you right now, you can't go off of that, because I started FPS VR before loading into the game, so that average is including the frame rate while in the menus and stuff. This is something I need to make sure you are aware of as you watch this video, because I know you're going to be looking at that average FPS number as you watch this. In some of the games I test, that number is accurate, but in others it is not. While working on this video, there were times I left FPS VR running as I went from one game to another, so while that counter did reset as I switched games, since I had it running while in the menus of a game and while it was loading and whatnot, it's giving us the average FPS for all of that. So yeah, I'll let you know when that number is accurate and when it isn't. And like I said, this is one of the cases where that average FPS counter is not accurate. Looking strictly at the current frame rate counter, you can see the 5070 Ti consistently performed slightly better by 2 to 3 FPS. So while not a big win, the 5070 Ti did come out on top in this one, but just barely. Now, one thing I feel is important to note is while I used the Steam VR runtime for this test, I actually got better performance using Virtual Desktop's VDXR runtime. I point this out because those of you who are new to PC VR, or those who haven't really encountered this much, may not know that certain games perform better using certain XR runtimes, and that the headset you're using also plays into that equation of which runtime is going to net you the best performance. I'm using a Quest 3 for this testing, so depending on the game, performance is better when using the Oculus runtime or VDXR than with Steam VR. That said, this video is about comparing the performance of two GPUs to one another. So, as long as I'm using the same XR runtime on both, it doesn't really matter so much if we're not using the most effective runtime. But at the same time, I felt this was something important to point out. While I didn't test the 4080 using VDXR in Le Mans, performance with the 5070 Ti was around 10 FPS higher using VDXR than it was using Steam VR, which is a significant improvement for doing nothing more than using a different runtime. As for why I didn't just use VDXR for this test, I wanted to use FPS VR to monitor performance in as many games as I possibly could for this video to keep things as consistent as possible. Also, I really like being able to see the GPU and CPU frame times, the VRAM and system RAM usage, as well as all the other metrics FPS VR displays. It's very helpful information. Okay, moving on to our next game. Alien Rogue Incursion was another title where performance between the 4080 and the 5070 Ti was nearly identical. Like with Le Mans Ultimate, this is a game where the average frame rate counter is not accurate because I had FPS VR running while loading the game and while navigating the menus. Looking at the current frame rate counter though, the 5070 Ti had a slight lead over the 4080 in much of this gameplay footage, but there were also times when the 5070 Ti was slower than the 4080, as well as times where performance was pretty much exactly the same. Now, how much of this was due to CPU bottlenecking, I'm not entirely sure, but you can see orange in the CPU frame time graph fairly often on both of these, and even red at times, which means my 9800X 3D CPU, as powerful as it is, was pretty well maxed out at those times. Well, at least on a few cores anyway. So, unfortunately, this test wasn't the most informative when it comes to making a GPU comparison, seeing as the CPU was impacting our performance a decent amount of the time. To benchmark Bootstrap Island, I'm using the game's tutorial, because unlike the actual part of the game that you play, it provides a more easily repeatable scenario. Once again, the average FPS counter is not accurate in this one. At least it isn't for the 4080. I mean, I hope it's fairly obvious when it's not accurate, because here the average is reading significantly higher than the current frame rate and keeps moving lower as the benchmark goes on. So yeah, anyway, you're going to want to pay attention to the current FPS to get the real story on this one. Like most of the games we've looked at so far, performance between the 4080 and the 5070 Ti was pretty close to the same here. There were times the 4080 ran a few FPS higher, and then others where the 5070 Ti was higher, so like we've seen a few times before, there was no clear winner in this one. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of all this more or less identical performance that's been going on. I think it's about time we break up the monotony here and finally see something different. So let's take a look at Into the Radius 2. Once again, the average FPS counter is not accurate in this one. I apologize for not doing better with this. For those of you who follow my channel, you know I've only recently began using FPS VR in my GPU benchmarking videos, so I'm still kind of figuring out my testing methodology and learning as I go. This is one of those things I have learned from though, and promise to do better in the future, to only enable FPS VR once the game instance is running, so the average FPS counter will be accurate. As for right now though, please disregard what the average FPS counter is saying. Without an on-rails benchmark for this game, just like I've done in the last few, I tried my best to follow the same path and do the same things as I walked through the Radius. And as you can see, the 5070 Ti was typically 8 to 10 FPS faster than the RTX 4080 in this one. Not a huge advantage by any means, but not inconsequential either. Thankfully, Assetto Corsa forces the average FPS counter to restart right as the benchmark begins. So for this test, the average FPS counter is 100% accurate. And as you can see throughout the duration of the benchmark, the 5070 Ti was a little more than 4 FPS faster than the 4080 on average. So another very close victory for the 50 series GPU. In hindsight, testing Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 wasn't the most appropriate game for this comparison, as it was completely CPU limited. Flight Simulator, however, is one of the staple games of VR, so I just kind of felt like I needed to test it anyway. Anyway, once again, the average FPS counter is not accurate in this one, but if you look at the GPU utilization and current FPS, you can see both GPUs are pretty well maxed out, and we're within 1 or 2 FPS of one another pretty much the entire time. But yeah, being CPU limited here, it was dictating our frame rate, so we weren't really able to see if one GPU was any faster than the other. For No Man's Sky, I did my best to walk the same loop around the area where my ship is parked, and once again, you're going to want to disregard the average FPS counter. Looking at the GPU utilization percentage and at the current frame rate, you can see performance was really close to the same on both GPUs. Analyzing this footage, I do feel the 5070 Ti was slightly better, but things were back and forth enough. I am not confident proclaiming either GPU as the winner. The final game I tested both the RTX 4080 and 5070 Ti with was VR Chat. Now, because this game has such a wide variety of worlds and player avatars you can encounter, I went to a world called VR CMark that has some nice on-rails benchmarks you can run that allow us to do perfect apples-to-apples comparisons. There are 2 GPU-focused benchmarks in this world, and in the first test, the 5070 Ti performed between 10 and 15 FPS better than the 4080, which in terms of percentage of performance uplift is massive when you consider the 4080 was averaging a frame rate in the 40s and the 5070 Ti close to 60. In the second GPU benchmark, which is the more difficult of the 2 to run, the 5070 Ti was 5 to 10 FPS better than the 4080, and most of the time it was closer to a 10 FPS advantage. In both cases, when you do the math on that, you're looking in the neighborhood of a 30% performance improvement for the 5070 Ti. Like I said at the beginning of the video, going into this, I totally expected the 5070 Ti to perform better than the 4080, in part due to what I saw when comparing the 5070 to the 4070 Super, which are 2 GPUs all the flat gaming benchmarks also show perform exactly the same. In that video, I said I suspected it's the GDDR7 on the 50 series GPU that's giving it the advantage over its previous generation counterpart. And once again, I suspect that may be what's giving the 5070 Ti its advantage in the few games it handily beats the 4080 in. But hey, let's be real here. I am just a guy who enjoys messing around with GPUs in VR. I am not a GPU engineer, nor do I have the knowledge or experience to make a definitive call on what about the hardware configuration is giving one GPU an advantage over the other. Having run all of these games on both GPUs, however, using the exact same settings, while performance was close a lot of the time, in the few games where we did see a clear winner, it was the 5070 Ti that was outperforming the 4080. So that in itself is a result I can report on. Now, would I recommend ditching your 4080 and switching to a 5070 Ti? Absolutely not. But for someone trying to decide between the two, hopefully this video has given you some good information to help you with your decision. Now, if you're curious how the 5070 Ti compares to AMD's current flagship, the 9070 XT, you're going to want to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss my next video, because that's exactly what's next on the docket. Come on, do it. You know you want to. Subscribe.